Well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all tonight. Thank you so much for coming. It's really wonderful to have so many folks here for this very important event together. And I want to thank you especially for supporting the work of the James M. Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. My name is Paul Spilsbury. I'm the Academic Dean and Professor of New Testament here at Regent College, and just at the moment serving as acting president while Jeff Greenman, our president, is on sabbatical in Melbourne. So good for him. We are here and we're having a good time together, and it's lovely to have you with us. As I'm sure you know, Regent College is a theological graduate school affiliated with UBC, where we seek to bring the riches of the Christian tradition into conversation with the pressing issues of our time. And the Houston Center is one part of this important work, seeking to foster interdisciplinary and interreligious dialogue on what it means to be human. So I'm so glad that you've joined with us tonight. I trust that you will find this to be an informative and enlightening engagement on a matter of such fundamental importance. Before I go any further, I do want to say a special welcome to Professor James Houston, who has joined us this evening. Jim, welcome. It's so lovely to have you with us. And so, without further ado, I'll hand over to the director of the Houston Center, Professor Jens Zimmerman.
Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. So my name is Jens Zimmerman, Professor of Theology here at Regent College and Director of the Houston Center. Thank you all so much for attending this important discussion on euthanasia. Before we begin, a brief note on how this is going down tonight. You will enjoy both a main lecture and then, after a brief stretching break of kind of Regent aerobics, right where you are, a panel discussion with representatives from different interest groups concerning euthanasia in Canada. Each panelist will state his position on euthanasia for 10 minutes here from the podium and then interact with our main speaker and each other. Given our time limitations and the number of speakers, we have to see if there's time for questions. I'm sure you will have some. But we hope you agree that even if that might not happen, that listening to these varied voices and becoming more informed about the current situation in Canada will be worth your coming tonight. Now to the topic at hand. The Houston Center is dedicated to facilitating conversations on the question of human identity and the common good of society. More specifically, we want to foster the richest possible descriptions of human identity, and we want to critique dehumanizing views of what it means to be human. Giving Regent's Christian convictions, we're particularly interested in preserving the dignity and unique worth of each person as reflective of God's image. As history has taught us, when social practices, for whatever reason, be it with the best of intentions, undermine human dignity, the mystery of personhood becomes quickly reduced to physical health or social utility with predictable, catastrophic results. And many are worrying that Canada's policies around MAID and so on are embarking on this dark descent into inhumanity. Now, the Supreme Court ruled assisted suicide constitutional in 2015, and in 2016, as you know, with Bill C-14, Canada joined countries like the Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain, Australia, and New Zealand, among others, in making MAID the law of the land. What sets our euthanasia policy apart from other countries is that in 2021, I believe, the Canadian government removed the restriction that made assisted suicide available only to those whose death was reasonably foreseeable. Now applicants simply had to describe a condition that was intolerable to them and that could not be relieved in ways that they considered acceptable. And we're now past, though I heard today there's a delay in this, to extend MAID even further to the mentally ill and mature minors, whatever that means. Is this progress, or is this a runaway train? What anthropological, legal, moral, and practical concerns are raised by the shift to subjective interpretations of a good death and the institutionalization of dying? Now, tonight we have assembled for you a number of expert voices to discuss these questions. And as I said, we'll begin with our main lecturer, Dr. Brian Bird. Dr. Bird is assistant professor at UBC's Peter A. Allard School of Law. His primary research interests are constitutional law and theory, interactions between courts and legislatures, and philosophy of law, among other areas. His academic writing has appeared in venues such as Dalhousie Law Journal, Cambridge Law Review, and the Supreme Court Law Review, and he is co-editor of The Forgotten Fundamental Freedoms of the Charters, the title. Now, I first encountered Brian's perspective on euthanasia in his informative and critical National Post article from May 4th, 2022, and I'm delighted that when I corresponded with him that he agreed to speak further to us on this topic tonight. So please help me welcome Dr. Bird.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Zimmerman and Professor Spilsbury before, and Professor Houston for being here, and for this invitation from the Houston Center to all of you who are here present this evening, and to my fellow panelists who will be joining me on stage later today. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. In preparing for this lecture, but before setting finger to keyboard, I found myself repeatedly returning to the same question. Where do we start? Where do we start on the topic of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada? Medical assistance in dying, as the law calls it, or MAID in abbreviated form. This practice, to be clear, is not palliative care. It does not, as the abbreviation MAID might suggest, refer to helping Canadians as they journey toward natural death by offering treatment to manage their pain or suffering. Assisted death is the deliberate act of ending a person's life, often through the administration of a lethal substance. In the less than 7 years since the first version of this practice became legal in Canada, the practice has dramatically expanded in scope. This expansion of assisted death in Canada has, it now seems indisputable to say, created major ripple effects within Canadian society. It is also increasingly becoming indisputable to attach certain adjectives to the nature of these ripple effects: troubling, disconcerting, unethical, terrifying. Last May in the National Post, I called assisted death a runaway train in Canada. I, for the most part, still subscribe to that view, but I also believe there is a growing consensus across ideological, philosophical, and other lines that this view is accurate and that we accordingly need to stop this train and get it back on track. But before we explore the shift that may be occurring in this country, a shift inspired by growing skepticism and worry about where we are headed on assisted death, how did we get here in the first place? How did Canada become what, in my view, can fairly be described as a haven for euthanasia? That part of the story starts in 2015, when the Supreme Court of Canada, in a unanimous ruling, concluded that Canada's absolute prohibition in the Criminal Code on assisted suicide violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The court held that this complete ban on assisted suicide, this rendering of assisted suicide a crime in all circumstances, violated the charter rights of adults who were grievously suffering from incurable medical conditions and who wished to cease living but could not kill themselves. You could tell where the court was headed after reading the first paragraph of its ruling in this 2015 case, which is known as the Cardus case, owing to the name of one of the individuals who initiated this constitutional challenge. Her name is Lee Carter. In that first paragraph, the court wrote these words: "It is a crime in Canada to assist another person in ending her own life. As a result, people who are grievously and irremediably ill cannot seek a physician's assistance in dying and may be condemned to a life of severe and intolerable suffering. A person facing this prospect has two options. She can take her own life prematurely, often by violent or dangerous means, or she can suffer until she dies from natural causes. The choice is cruel," end quote. The court in Cardus concluded that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms provides access to physician-assisted death for a competent adult who clearly consents to the termination of life and has a grievous and irremediable medical condition that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. Parliament was ultimately granted a year and a half by the court to respond to this ruling in the form of legislation. Parliament indeed responded in July of 2016 with what I believe many Canadians, including perhaps some of those who advocated for what the court ruled in Carter, expected would be not just the first, but the final version of assisted death in Canada. As many of you know, that would not be the case. But what did that first version of assisted death contained in the July 2016 federal legislation say? It decriminalized the provision of physician-assisted death where an adult person who was suffering intolerably from a grievous and irremediable medical condition consented to assisted death, and, importantly, the natural death of that person was on the horizon, or, to quote the legislation, where natural death was reasonably foreseeable. It's important to note here that, in Canada, legislation has not yet permitted assisted death in cases where the sole underlying condition is mental illness. Expansion of assisted death to encompass this scenario is, however, currently in the works. More on that later. Before the ink had dried on the first version of assisted death in the summer of 2016, fresh lawsuits were initiated in Canada to challenge the aspect of the first version that confined assisted death to adults whose death was reasonably foreseeable. The litigants argued that the court's ruling in Carter did not limit the constitutional guarantee of physician-assisted death to what you might term end-of-life scenarios, but also encompassed adults whose death was not near, but whose suffering was intolerable and medical condition was incurable. And even if Carter did limit assisted death to end-of-life scenarios, these litigants argued that the Constitution, the Charter, demanded broader access to assisted death. Before speaking about the result of this litigation challenging the first version of assisted death, it's worth noting, as I alluded to moments ago, that the first version of assisted death was viewed by many as consistent with what the court had said in 2015 with respect to what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms requires and the delicate task for Parliament in designing a response to this constitutional ruling. The federal government seemingly believed that this response harmonized with that ruling. It also strikes me that the notion of, quote, dying with dignity, a phrase that I think captures in broad brushstrokes the view of many who advocated for what the court ruled in Carter, strongly suggests that what was being pursued in that case was assisted death when the person is, in fact, dying or when death is on the horizon, not when the death of a person is far off or unforeseeable. Be that as it may, the litigation which claimed that the first version of assisted death was not broad enough in scope encountered success in a ruling of a Quebec court in 2019. In that case, the judge agreed that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms provides for assisted death to competent and consenting adults whose suffering was intolerable and illness was incurable, regardless of whether the natural death of the adult was on the horizon or reasonably foreseeable. Rather than attempt to appeal that ruling all the way to the Supreme Court, as many disability organizations urged it to do, the federal government opted instead to codify the essence of that ruling in 2019 into what can be called the second version of assisted death. That second version was enacted by Parliament in March of 2021 after an intense flurry of back and forth between the House of Commons and the Senate. So at that time, less than 4 years after Canada legalized the first version of assisted death, that was confined to end-of-life scenarios, a tectonic shift in its own right for a society, we expanded assisted death to encompass intolerable and irreversible suffering at any stage of adult life. In addition, the second version of assisted death included provision in itself for what could be termed the third, though yet to be realized version of this practice in this country, assisted death for adults whose sole underlying condition is mental illness. The legislation of March 2021 that enacted the second version of assisted death provided that 2 years later, assisted death for adults suffering only from mental illness would be legal in this country. This next step, the third version of assisted death, was therefore set to take effect this March, about a month from now. In December, however, the federal government announced that it would delay but not abandon this step. At the moment, the federal government still plans to expand assisted death such that adults suffering solely from mental illness will be able to avail themselves of this practice and end their lives. And as for those who may be reading the news today, the federal government indeed tabled legislation to delay that next step, that third version, until next March of 2024. Before concluding this discussion of the legal history surrounding assisted death in Canada and moving on to share some thoughts and reflections on the broader implications of this trajectory, I should note that the sense that this train is indeed going off the rails is palpable when one considers that, just a few months ago, the Quebec College of Physicians recommended before a parliamentary committee studying the future of assisted death that the practice should be expanded to include infants with severe illnesses. Such a step would not only render what is currently considered infanticide legal, it would also mark an official abandonment of consent as a guardrail in the provision of assisted death, given that newborns and infants cannot meaningfully consent to death. That same feeling of derailment is reinforced when one considers that the same parliamentary committee is also exploring the option of rendering mature minors eligible for assisted death, or allowing Canadians to provide consent to assisted death long before they actually experience the medical circumstances and suffering that would render them eligible to die in this way, so-called advance directives for assisted death. So Canada is at a critical juncture on assisted death. As the practice is further and further expanded, it becomes more and more difficult to cite reasons as to why the practice shouldn't simply be granted to anyone who wants to end their life, no matter the reason. If individual autonomy is the animating concept at work in justifying the legalization of assisted death, and there's ample evidence in the Supreme Court's 2015 ruling that this concept of individual autonomy is driving the bus, what is the principled justification for withholding this practice from any person who wishes to receive it? Turning from the legal history to lived experience of assisted death in Canada, I again find myself asking myself where to begin. There are so many elements to the story of assisted death in this country. What the experience of this practice in Canada to date says not just about the practice itself, but the state of our society and social fabric, and what the road ahead might look like. Perhaps it would be good to start by acknowledging that the concerns around the so-called slippery slope that were voiced at the time the Supreme Court was considering opening the door to assisted death in Canada, even voiced directly to the Supreme Court itself, has, I think it can now be said without any doubt, materialized. Voices that warned us at the start about where this road might lead were at times called fearmongers and irrational. When the Supreme Court of Canada opened the door to euthanasia in 2015, the court itself dismissed these concerns by saying that Canada has a, quote, very different medical legal culture than countries by which that time had broad euthanasia regimes. But we failed to grasp that by allowing euthanasia, we would radically reshape that culture overnight. Truth be told, I think we can fairly describe the experience in this country as resembling more of a cliff rather than a slope. We have, in these 7 years, lived through something closer to a free fall than a slide. For the laws of a democratic country to change dramatically on a matter of bedrock significance, the rate of change is usually incremental and slow. What we have witnessed in Canada since 2015, from an absolute prohibition on assisted death to assisted death being legal for any consenting adult with intolerable and incurable suffering, with expansion relating to mental illness on the horizon, and other candidates for assisted death in the conversation, is nothing short of revolutionary. These changes touch upon the definitional aspects of our society, the kind of society, in a fundamental sense, Canada claims to be. Assisted death, owing to what it is, can never be a cosmetic change for a society. It's a transformative change for the society in question. Now, some, perhaps many, say that this path that Canada has followed on assisted death and the path that lies ahead represents progress. These changes, in other words, are markers of a society that is normatively good, just, fair, and equitable. I disagree. I believe that euthanasia in any form is the wrong choice for a society. In addition to considerations surrounding the sanctity of each and every human life, opening the door to euthanasia opens a Pandora's box of risk. And it's increasingly clear that in Canada, we're witnessing the realization of those risks. The legalization and promotion of euthanasia as healthcare also sends disturbing messages, teaching that human life is a depreciating asset with a best before date, or that certain conditions are a fate worse than death. Euthanasia, even in its most confined form, betrays a truth that sits at the heart of a civilized society. Human dignity, each person's intrinsic worth and value, never disappears, no matter how dire the circumstances may be. On the matter of the risks associated with opening the door to assisted death, even to the first version, where it's confined to situations in which a person's natural death is reasonably foreseeable, the reality is that legalizing and normalizing assisted death creates the possibility that persons who do not truly desire to die in this manner will nonetheless decide to do so. And statistics on assisted death in Canada from the federal government suggest that this phenomenon may already be operative. Among the Canadians who died via assisted death in 2021, nearly 36% cited perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers as forming part of their decision, and around 17% cited isolation or loneliness. While these Canadians would have had to point to some irremediable medical condition causing them profound suffering in order to qualify for assisted death, what we are witnessing in Canada with increasing regularity are situations in which factors other than the medical condition itself are serving as significant motivating factors for the decision to receive assisted death. Indeed, over the past year or so, several media reports have recounted the stories of Canadians who find themselves in difficult socioeconomic or personal situations and have applied for, and in certain cases have been approved for, assisted death. We have heard stories of Canadians facing homelessness or who cannot find adequate housing, opting to pursue assisted death because they believe they have reached a dead end. We have heard stories of veterans seeking assistance for post-traumatic stress disorder and bureaucrats suggesting assisted death as something they should consider. What was originally supposed to be an option only for individuals knocking on death's door is now being pursued by, and in certain cases, proactively offered to Canadians whose death is not even on the radar. Canadians who in principle wish to live, but cannot avail themselves of the assistance they need to get back on their feet. We are now far beyond what the Supreme Court contemplated in 2015 when it spoke of assisted death as a, quote, carefully designed system imposing stringent limits that are scrupulously monitored and enforced, end quote. It is startling to consider, in light of how these Canadians who have been in the news describe their circumstances, that their underlying illness may not be the primary factor driving their pursuit of assisted death. Speaking of monitoring and enforcement, a combination of investigative journalism and statistics, and the statistics on assisted death also suggest that assisted death is not particularly difficult to access in Canada. In one of the first media reports about how Canadians having trouble in obtaining basic resources and services are opting to apply for assisted death, CTV News reported in April of 2022 on 2 women who had requested assisted death due to obstacles in obtaining housing that would be suitable for their diagnosis of multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, which features intolerance to smoke, air fresheners, cleaning agents, and other airborne irritants. One of the women, 31 years old and living in Toronto, said she found applying for assisted death, quote, surprisingly much easier than searching for suitable housing. She obtained one of the two approvals from healthcare professionals that the law requires before an adult can receive assisted death. Later in 2022, she received the second approval. I couldn't find anything further on her story. The other woman, there were 2 women in that original story, also suffering from living with MCS, aged 51 years old, had already died via assisted death. To put matters into perspective, California legalized assisted death in 2016, the same year that Canada's first version of assisted death became legal. The populations of California and Canada are roughly comparable. In 2021, 486 people in California died via assisted death. In Canada, more than 10,000 people died this way in the same year. Now, it's important to note that California's system for assisted death has remained in the first version mode, so to speak, while eligibility criteria for in Canada for assisted death have expanded, as I described earlier. But even looking at the years in which Canada was in first version mode, the comparison is still concerning. In 2016, more than 1,000 Canadians died via assisted death, more than double the number in California that year. And the number of Canadians who have died by assisted death has grown exponentially grew exponentially prior to the expansion in 2021 to persons suffering intolerably and incurably at any stage of adult life, landing at around 7,600 assisted deaths in 2020, which was the last full year of the first version. As for what investigative journalism has revealed as to the degree of scrupulosity that is being applied to the provision of assisted death in Canada, the picture is not positive. In an in-depth article published last December in the New Atlantis entitled No Other Options, Alexander Rakin argues that the system of assisted death in Canada substantially lacks, in a meaningful way, the safeguards that were promised by advocates for assisted death and upon which the courts placed heavy reliance in coming to the conclusion that an absolute prohibition on assisted death is not constitutionally justifiable. Rakin describes a constellation of factors that contribute to this state of affairs: doctor shopping for assisted death approvals, subjective and flexible interpretation of the law's eligibility requirements for assisted death depending on the provider, rather feeble monitoring and minimal enforcement by civil authorities and police, to name a few factors. The unshakable picture that emerges from Rakin's article is that certain members of the network of providers of assisted death can go, and in some cases do go, about their work in a relatively uninspected manner. Rakin quotes Nancy Hansen, the director of the Disability Studies program at the University of Manitoba, as saying that, practically speaking, there's no consequences for non-compliance with the law. As for why that might be the case, Rakin puts it bluntly: the people doing the training, the assessments, the procedure, and informing the review are all the same people. As prominent assisted death advocate and provider Ellen Wiebe has said publicly, this is, quote, the most rewarding work we've ever done. She's also quoted in Rakin's article as saying that it is, quote, rare for assessors to have patients who have unmet needs, but it does happen. Usually these unmet needs are around loneliness and poverty. As all Canadians have rights to an assisted death, people who are lonely or poor also have those rights, end quote. This sentiment that assisted death is the right of all Canadians has also appeared in recent months in the public statements of Canada's Minister of Justice. In a recent episode of the CBC's Fifth Estate, Minister of Justice David Lametti says that the Supreme Court concluded in 2015 that assisted death is a right enjoyed by all Canadians. He points to the rulings of courts in this country as substantiating his view, for example, that it would be unconstitutional to exclude persons suffering solely from mental illness from accessing assisted death. This is a questionable, indeed I would say incorrect, characterization of what the courts have said on this matter. The Supreme Court of Canada in 2015, in the Cardus decision, expressly noted that its ruling did not encompass euthanasia for, quote, persons with psychiatric disorders. While subsequent rulings by courts on assisted death have not excluded the prospect of assisted death being required by the Charter, no court in Canada has specifically concluded that legalizing assisted death for persons suffering solely from mental illness is required or mandated by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For that matter, as discussed earlier, it's not even crystal clear that the Supreme Court concluded in Cardus that assisted death beyond the end-of-life context is mandated by the Charter. Other remarks by the Minister of Justice in the Fifth Estate episode are striking in light of what has been discovered by authors like Alexander Rakin in terms of how the provision of assisted death is functioning in this country. On more than one occasion, the Minister of Justice expresses his confidence in how assisted death is being provided in Canada and his faith in the safeguards that have been put in place by the law. In listening to the Minister speak about the provision of assisted death, one cannot help but perceive that the federal government has essentially handed the file over to healthcare authorities and wiped its hands clean. As for the stories of Canadians who have sought approval for assisted death due to their adverse socioeconomic or personal circumstances, the Minister suggests that these cases are few and far between and that the system is functioning well overall. But perhaps most troubling are the Minister's comments in this Fifth Estate episode about suicide. When asked by the interviewer how assisted death, in the form it has come to take in Canada, and given where this practice seems to be going, is not simply the state enabling suicide, the Minister described the practice as a, quote, species of suicide, and noted that, quote, suicide in and of itself is not against the law. The interviewer then interjects to highlight what many observers have noted is a deep tension, if not an outright contradiction. Our investment of much time and money to prevent persons from committing suicide on the one hand, and the ever-expanding contours of assisted death on the other hand. The Minister of Justice expressed his view that there is no inconsistency between these efforts, between those efforts against suicide and a broad right to assisted death on the other, noting that, quote, the state only moves in, quote, unquote, where the person is suffering from a grievous and irremediable illness that is incurable. If I can be blunt, the disconnect between the Minister's statements on assisted death and the on-the-ground experience reported by various media outlets as well as investigative journalists is astonishing. How does the Minister square his remarks with the growing evidence that many Canadians are seeking assisted death not only because of their illness, but because of the difficult living conditions and circumstances to which their illness has led them? Or with the ongoing reality that the quality of palliative care in this country is inadequate, which inevitably renders assisted death more appealing than it might otherwise be if the quality of palliative care were better? Or with the statistics from the federal government that show that many individuals are choosing assisted death, at least in part, because of factors such as their perception of being a burden on others, or from factors such as loneliness. Apart from the disconnect between the lived experience of assisted death and the experience being articulated by the government and advocates, there's also a troubling articulation of the law, from the Minister of Justice, no less. The Minister cites the courts and the Charter as requiring a broad form of assisted death, a form encompassing assisted death for persons suffering solely from mental illness. In addition to what I said earlier about what the courts have in fact said and not said on this matter, has the Minister considered that governments might breach the Charter by rendering the criteria for assisted death so broad and access to the procedure so straightforward while offering insufficient support for persons who are suffering and wish to live or have a natural death? One can quite easily imagine how this situation might endanger the lives of Canadians and thereby violate their fundamental rights. What message are we sending to our fellow Canadians living with disabilities when we render assisted death easily available to them, perhaps rendering it easier to access than the supports they need to live? What message are we sending when we suggest or even encourage them to consider assisted death, either because the proper supports are lacking or because we think that such a life is not worth living? And if a person's mental illness inclines that person to suicidal ideation, does the government not jeopardize that person's life by offering that person assisted suicide? One of the most jarring moments in Canada's experience of assisted death thus far occurred last October, when Quebec fashion retailer Simons released a 3-minute video showcasing a 37-year-old woman from British Columbia who wished to end her life through assisted death. Her name was Jennifer Hatch. Jennifer had been suffering from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a condition that affects the connective tissue in the body. The video is entitled "All is Beauty." It features images of people on beaches and describes, quote, the most beautiful exit at one point. Jennifer died by assisted death the day before the video was released. If it weren't sufficiently disturbing, let alone bewildering, to see a major Canadian retailer showcase and promote assisted death, what made matters worse was the subsequent revelation that Jennifer had told friends and family that she wanted to live, but for years could not manage to locate appropriate care for her condition. Explaining the rationale for the video, a Simons executive said this: "I think we sincerely believe that companies have a responsibility to participate in communities and to help build the communities that we want to live in tomorrow and leave to our children. It does not take much reflection to surmise what Simons thinks about how assisted death fits into the pursuit of a good society." Last December, Ross Douthat of the New York Times wrote a stinging critique of assisted death in Canada, using the Simons video as a point of entry. For Douthat, the video teaches that we should, quote, "believe in the holiness of euthanasia." He goes on to articulate some of the undercurrents and forces at work in what we are seeing in Canada, and I believe it's worthwhile to quote him somewhat at length. He says this: "In the era of populism, there's a lively debate about when a democracy ceases to be liberal. But the advance of euthanasia presents a different question. What if a society remains liberal but ceases to be civilized? The rules of civilization necessarily include gray areas. It's not barbaric for the law to acknowledge hard choices in end-of-life care about when to withdraw life support or how aggressively to manage agonizing pain. It is barbaric, however, to establish a bureaucratic system that offers death as a reliable treatment for suffering and enlists the healing profession in delivering this cure. And while there may be worse evils ahead, this isn't a slippery slope argument. When 10,000 people are availing themselves of your euthanasia system every year, you have already entered the dystopia." So, is Ross Douthat correct? Have we in Canada already entered the dystopia? Is the situation around assisted death in this country something worse than a runaway train? Have we, in other words, gone past the point of no return? I believe that the answer to these questions is no. Canada is certainly going down a profoundly troubling path, and if we continue going down it, we will indeed reach a dystopian destination with much destruction inflicted along the way. But I also believe that we can still turn things around. I believe we can choose to reject the worldview that normalizes and even celebrates assisted death in Canada and replace it with an undying commitment to providing the proper support, care, attention, and resources to our fellow Canadians who for one reason or another find themselves in difficult and even dire circumstances. Imagine if all the time and resources spent on assisted death were directed toward the support, treatment, and care that many of the people pursuing assisted death say they cannot access. This is a choice available to us, just as choosing to go down the road of a highly permissive regime of assisted death was a choice. Some will say that the Constitution stands in the way of dismantling assisted death in this country. As a constitutional scholar and law professor, it would indeed be problematic for me to ignore the reality of what the Supreme Court has said about what the Constitution says on assisted death. But part of the picture is that we currently lack clarity on that very point. For my part, I'm skeptical that the Charter right to life, liberty, and security of the person guarantees a right to assisted death in any form, and I believe that what we have seen in only a few years after opening the door to assisted death provides a strong basis for arguing that the risks associated with opening that door, even to the first version of assisted death, are simply too great and justify the absolute prohibition that once existed in this country. The Supreme Court has said it is appropriate to revisit past decisions where there has been a change in circumstances or evidence that fundamentally shifts the parameters of the debate. Perhaps the story of assisted death since it arrived in Canada is that change. Yet the current state of the law is what the Supreme Court articulated in 2015. The Charter provides for some version of assisted death, at the very least in the form of the first version. But there is progressively less clarity on what the Constitution requires as we travel down the miles of additional railroad that has been constructed in relation to assisted death in this country after the first version arrived in 2016. There is merit, I believe, in taking the step of seeking further clarity from the Supreme Court by way of the federal government asking the court to issue an advisory opinion on the forms of assisted death mandated by the Constitution. To the extent that the Constitution does not demand certain forms of assisted death, politicians and lawmakers will have to make their case for those forms of assisted death on grounds other than alleged constitutional compliance or fidelity to the Charter. I believe the profoundly troubling signs we have already seen in the short history of assisted death in this country renders that case difficult to make, and increasingly more difficult with each passing day. Beyond the possibility of making a U-turn on assisted death at the level of what our laws say, there's also a need for amendment at the individual level. There's a deep need in this country to renew the bonds of solidarity. It's hard to escape the sense that we have all, to various degrees, been affected by individualism and the notion that we are, beyond our close circle of family and friends, atomized islands unconnected to one another. Just imagine the benefits that would accrue to the common good if we were to truly view and treat one another as brothers and sisters, instead of being ruled by the pervasive sentiment of indifference that can animate our dealings with persons beyond our close circle. Imagine if we were to truly accept that instead of this or that person that I know or encounter who is enduring a terrible adversity of some sort, that it could be me instead. What if all of us were to take even a few small steps in going out of our way to reduce that suffering? I know it sounds cliche, but I genuinely believe, and maybe it's surprising to hear from a law professor, that the law is not the be-all and end-all to remedying social illness. First and foremost, it's up to civil society to build up and sustain the ingredients of daily life that facilitate human flourishing and the common good. Hitting the legislative brakes on assisted death is by no means the end of the story to solving the problems in relation to which assisted death is currently being advertised as a solution. The prevalence of radical individual autonomy, a prevalence well established prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in 2015, played a major role in getting us into this mess. If we're serious about tackling human suffering in its various forms and in a way that does not include death as a so-called solution or cure, each of us will need to do our part to counter the damaging consequences of a misguided understanding of autonomy that holds significant sway in our society. An example of this solidarity came about in response to the media reports of Amir Farsood, a 54-year-old man in Ontario whose story surfaced in media reports last fall. Farsood was living with severe and chronic back pain and was facing the prospect of homelessness. He was living in a house with 2 other people, and the house had gone up for sale. He'd been living off of social assistance and said he could not find anywhere else to live that he could afford. Faced with this prospect, Amir decided he would pursue assisted death if it came to pass. As he put it, "I don't want to die, but I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die." At the time his story was first reported, Farsood had received the approval of 1 doctor for assisted death and needed 1 more approval. But a little over a month after his story was reported, a crowdfunding initiative had raised more than $60,000 to support Farsood. As heartening as it is to witness the outpouring of support and solidarity from Canadians who have no personal connection to Mr. Farsood, apart from hearing his story on the news, one cannot help but feel a piercing sadness over the many other Canadians who find themselves in similar circumstances as Farsood and who either will or have already sought assisted death. In February of 2021, about a month before assisted death was expanded in this country to encompass intolerable and incurable suffering at any stage of adult life, with the exception of suffering caused solely by mental illness, the second version of assisted death, a group of United Nations experts, including the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, wrote to the Canadian government to convey what has turned out to be a prescient warning of what might occur if this expansion of assisted death were to take place. The authors of that letter wrote these words: "From a disability rights perspective, there's a grave concern that if assisted dying is made available for all persons with a health condition or impairment, regardless of whether they are close to death, a social assumption might follow, or be subtly reinforced, that it's better to be dead than to live with a disability. Therefore, a major concern must be that persons with a disability, and perhaps especially those with newly acquired impairment, may opt too readily for assisted dying, based on the internalization of prejudices, fears, and low expectations of living with a disability. even before having the chance of coming to terms with and adapting to their new disability status. I'll conclude by sharing a recent experience that struck me to the core. I was at a Vancouver Canucks hockey game last week, and as is customary before the game, the crowd rose for the singing of the national anthem. During the singing of O Canada, I was particularly moved by the line that appears 3 times in the English version. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. I've often thought of this line in our national anthem in terms of national defense, standing on guard for Canada in times of war. But on this occasion, in hearing these words, and in the lead up to preparing for this lecture, they hit me in a different way. We have an obligation to stand on guard for each other. And when it comes to assisted death, we are, in my opinion, failing in a profound way to discharge this obligation. We are failing to stand on guard for our fellow Canadians who are vulnerable, suffering, or need our help. We're failing to convey loud and clear, without equivocation, in word and in deed, that each and every person in this country, regardless of their circumstances and characteristics, matters equally and bears intrinsic dignity. This failure to stand on guard for each other is not an accident. It's a deliberate choice. As more and more of our fellow Canadians are offered euthanasia as a solution to hardship, this country correspondingly loses its ability to call itself a humane, or as Ross Douthat put it, a civilized society. It would be easy, faced with these hard realities, to become despondent and even to despair over what is currently taking place in Canada in relation to assisted death and where we seem to be headed. And yet, as I listened to the singing of the national anthem at that hockey game, I found in that moment that my affection for this country, my true patriot love for Canada, has not been erased and still abides. Because even amid this darkness, I genuinely believe that the moral, ethical, and virtuous foundations of this country, foundations that have been laid, reinforced, and constructed upon for eons longer than the lifetime of assisted death in Canada, foundations that are, I believe, inherently incompatible with assisted death, remain very much intact. These foundations strike me as alive and well when we witness Canadians in healthcare and other professions refuse to participate in this darkness, when we witness those and other Canadians speak out against assisted death and risk the loss of prestige and even their careers, and when Canadians give their hard-earned money to someone they've never met and never will meet to save their life. I cannot begin to comprehend the pain and upheaval experienced by persons who are contemplating assisted death or by persons who are pursuing this path. I also can't comprehend what it must be like for persons who are close to those who are contemplating, pursuing, and have even completed this path. Some of us here tonight may fall into those categories. Perhaps we know people that do. I cast no judgment on persons who have chosen assisted death, and I fully recognize that incredibly difficult circumstances that no one would wish upon themselves or others, have led them to this place. My focus is on how we've responded as a society, institutions and individuals alike, to persons who find themselves in this place. I fear that we have, in constructing this path of assisted death, handed these Canadians and ourselves despair instead of hope, death instead of dignity, and dismissal instead of belonging. This is a tragedy, and we've created it. But our lawmakers need not think that the only way forward is making assisted death more available to more Canadians. Our lawmakers can, if they wish, choose to reject any further expansion of assisted death in this country. They can not only hit the brakes on assisted death, they can turn us in the other direction. And it may be that in recent months, an awakening has begun, an awakening to the disturbing effects of our embrace of assisted death. And this awakening has the potential, I believe, to grow in strength and translate into a change of hearts, minds, and laws. This awakening, sparked in large part by the reporting of the media, has spurred many Canadians to think differently about this issue, speak out, and take action. And if that awakening continues to grow, I believe that what now feels like a runaway train will get back on track. This moment in our history is a bleak midwinter for Canada. But I believe if this awakening keeps gaining momentum, the bleakness will sooner rather than later turn into hope, and the winter will turn into spring. Given where we are tonight in the chapel of Regent College, I feel I can safely invoke another line of our national anthem, a line that comes right before the one I quoted earlier. May God keep our land glorious and free, and may each of us stand on guard, not just for Canada, but more importantly, for each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for this deeply moving appeal to our humanity and a clarifying talk. So this is the time where you get a 5-minute stretcher, and you can not move around, but just move a little bit while we transition to our panel. So you can please ask our panelists to come up, and I'll call you back to order in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we could find our seats, please, so we can proceed to the second portion of the evening. So we now turn to our panel discussion. As I said, each panelist will present his position for about 10 minutes. And please, let's not go over those 10 minutes, so we have time for the panel discussion. And after these 3 presentations, Dr. Bird will interact with the panelists and moderate the discussion. So let me briefly introduce our panelists in the order of their presentations. So Neil Belanger is Chief Executive Officer of Indigenous Disability Canada and of the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. Under Neil's leadership, BCANDS was approved in 2018 for special consultative status with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Development. Neil has also served in a variety of advisory roles to government and community-based organizations, including the Ministers' RSDP Action Group, the Ministers' Advisory Forum on Poverty Reduction, and the Ministers' Council on Employment and Accessibility. And just on the way over, I had a brief talk with Neil. He's crazy busy, as you might imagine. I'm really thankful, Neil, that you made your way over here to talk to us. And next we'll have the Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett, who is the Faith Community Program Director at Cardus, an Ontario-based Christian think tank devoted to reimagining institutional life for the common good. He's also an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the Eparchy of Toronto and Eastern Canada. Father Deacon Andrew served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom. That's when I first saw him, I remember that. Which didn't last all that long, no. Because religious freedom is all not that important. And he led Global Affairs Canada Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us from Ottawa. And then finally, we have Dr. Williard Johnston, who is a seasoned family physician here from Vancouver. He has practiced in the Vancouver area for over 30 years. He's also the former chair of the British Columbia Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. So thank you, Dr. Johnston, for joining us. We know doctors are never busy, so thank you for coming. Okay, so I'll hand it over, if you just can go in that order. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. Simgiget Sigidam Hanak Kobolitsik. My name is Neil Belanger, and I am the CEO for Indigenous Disability Canada and the British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Musqueam people who are on today as well. And Brian took my speech, and now I'm stuck here saying nothing. So I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm an administrator. Our organization was thrust into MAID years ago when it first came out, and went particularly in relation to Track 2 for persons with disabilities, chronic illness, and disease, and the end-of-life criteria. So we've been active in that file for some time, and tonight I just want to talk a little bit about our experience with that, where we sit, and some of the things that are happening within our sector. So with Track 2, with the end-of-life criteria, our organization and the programs that we deliver The majority of the programs that we deliver is to help people have a good life, to make sure that they have the supports necessary to thrive and to be active members of their community. With the expansion of MAID, we were one of the organizations that now have a poster on our door that says, "You're safe here. You will never be offered medical assistance in dying as an alternative to providing you with the supports that you need." And that's starting to pick up with other disability organizations across Canada, because as Brian said, we've reached a point here that I've never seen before. And when I had to testify to the committee, the special committee on MAID, I said to him, I've never thought in my 30-year career in health and disability that I would ever have to stand here and speak to why we should not euthanize 12-year-old children. But here we sit today, and with Brian, with what you said, I hope that we can make a change here. But it'll be people here in this audience here and people across Canada that will make that change. And largely people have been silent until recent. There's been a lot of news out there. There's been a lot of stories. Some of them are not true, but many of them are. For us, when we testified and when we worked with our communities, the majority of the people that we work, they want to have a good life. They're not looking for medical assistance in dying. The people that Brian spoke about, Sophia and Denise, we work with both of them. Sophia, not their real names, she was a 51-year-old who had multiple chemical sensitivities that tried for years to get housing. She did not want to die. She wanted the supports to live. But her disability made her eligible for MAID, and she found doctors that would sign off on it. The government of Ontario ignored her pleas, and at the last minute, we had organizations coming across Canada to help her, but she was done. She said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm done." Denise, 31-year-old, same situation. She is still alive today. While we and other organizations rallied to the cause to raise some money for her and working with the people that are supporting her in Ontario as well. But you can't do that for everybody. There's too many people. Within the Indigenous population of Canada, Canada as a whole has a population, 22% of Canadians live with a disability. It's much higher with the Indigenous community. We have higher rates of suicide. We have higher rates of poverty, lack of service, and anti-Indigenous racism permeates through all systems, including health. And not all doctors or nurses are racist, but there are some, and we've seen that with Joyce Echuan. We've seen that with Keegan Combs here. We've seen that through the In Plain Sight report. We've seen it in the last couple of years with national meetings held by the government of Canada because it's so rampant. And that affects MAID as well. Even when we've seen doctors and medical personnel, they look at some of the people that we serve and they say, you know, you would be better off with MAID. Look at, you're Indigenous, you're living in poverty, you have a disability. So even then we're facing these biases and these conscious decisions by people who may even think they're doing something good and saying, this is an option. And when you have somebody in authority telling you that this is an option and you're a person that doesn't have the power, it's not an option. You're taking that as somebody saying, that's something that you should do. And that's what we see going across here today. So, how much time I got left? I could go on for hours here, but he stole most of my stuff. So as we move forward, and I want to be confident, and I know that maybe in the question period I'm not really getting into the Indigenous side of it, but I can tell you this: when we testified, you know, the number of times that we've been there, and all Indigenous witnesses that testified, the majority of them, the vast majority said, MAID is not for us. This is not what we believe in. This is not part of our culture. This is not what we want. Canada has implemented UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In the declaration, it says that Indigenous people have a right to determine their own welfare, including their health systems. Indigenous people in Canada have not been consulted on MAID, not in any tangible form. 2 expert panel reports both note that there's been nothing there. When I testified, they wanted me to say, okay, well, we're going to still go moving forward, so how do we make it better? And I said, stop. Stop this today. You can't ask me to give recommendations about how you can engage people to accept MAID better when they're the people that you failed to engage in the first place. But that's the mentality we're working with. MAID is on a track going forward. Mature minors, advanced directives. It is a slippery slope. But again, it's people in this room here that can make a difference. And if you don't do something, then we're going to see it go even further, because the government will listen, and I truly believe that this pause on mental illness is because of organizations like us and others and individuals, persons with disabilities saying no more. This is not right, because we lacked that for a long time. So if we are going to stop this, and if we are going to be a country that does embrace everyone and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to live a good life and have a good death, you know, we need everybody to step up and help us. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Well, let me also offer my thanks again to Jens and to the Houston Center, to Region for hosting this most worthwhile evening on a subject that, as Dr. Bird has demonstrated, should occupy the minds of all of us. So thank you to my friend Brian Bird for his, as always, thoughtful reflection on our times and on how we got to this point where the runaway train is not only hurtling uncontrolled, it seems, along a dangerous precipice, it's about to take us all down into a chasm. To continue with the metaphor, it's a chasm at the bottom of which already lies, at least in Canada, it seems, but I don't think it's actually as bad, and I think I agree with Brian on this, the wreckage of a Christian anthropology that once helped to bind this country together, Christians and non-Christians alike. And it's this anthropology I wish to focus on in my reply to Dr. Bird's address. Despite this temporary delay that has now been extended to a year in the expansion of Canada's euthanasia regime permitting doctor-assisted suicide for the mentally ill, our country is still moving towards this tragic dystopian reality. We have become a society in which you are recognized as only having dignity or inherent value as a human being if you are possessed of a sound mind, in a sound body, that you are socially, economically, and I dare say politically useful. Simply because something is legal does not make it true, or good, for that matter. This law, this regime that we have in place has embraced this flawed anthropology, a flawed understanding of the person that embraces the view that the human person only has real value if they can act independently. This is not only a deeply disordered understanding of the human person. As human people, we're bound in community, but it spells the end of genuine compassion and true dignity in this country. These wonderful understandings of compassion, suffering with someone, dignity that is bound up in who we are as persons, these have been distorted and warped to such a degree that now we think that to kill someone is dignified. What is most tragic is that we are not heeding our deepest conscience, which tells us that this is all wrong. And instead we accept the advancement of euthanasia as progress. But progress for the sake of progress. There's no end. It's this fait accompli. As human beings, we have deep conscience. Whether we're Christians or non-Christians, theists or atheists, as St. John Henry Newman speaks of it, this aboriginal vicar, our conscience that tells us what is right and what is wrong. Why is it that we are still rightly shocked and sorrowed when a young person ends their life? As Brian rightly highlighted, why do we continue to invest time and resources in suicide prevention, especially among vulnerable populations? It is because teen suicide is unexpected and the hopefulness of a young life is violently ended. For vulnerable populations, we recognize their vulnerability, and out of genuine compassion and charity, we seek to assist them as best we can. Yet, in the sanitized and safe environment of the hospital room or the family home, we cleanly and nicely murder someone. Let's call it what it is, albeit with their permission, maybe. In this disordered view, true dignity and compassion no longer exist. Hope is gone, there is no future, and so there is left only the will. Just because a majority of Canadians support doctor-assisted suicide does not mean that it is right or that it is good for us, individually or, as Dr. Bird has rightly pointed out, as a nation. It is not good for us. It is not good for our communities. It breaks apart community. Put another way, just because, as I said, something is legal does not mean that it's true or good. Positive law is not always terribly positive. It is, however, very consistent with the arguments made for abortion. If human life can be ended at the beginning because it is inconvenient or causes emotional anguish, it can be ended at the end. That's consistent, I suppose, in this disordered anthropology. In this understanding, we will our life, not God. We will it. We are God's and the sole authors of our destiny. At the heart of this debate is not a discussion of legal protections or permissions, of health policy goals, or of individual rights. At its core, the debate over euthanasia is about the very nature of the person. In a commentary on human dignity, Who Are You? Reaffirming Human Dignity, we released at Cardus in October 2019, we argued that human beings are not objects to be used, but subjects to be loved, and that coming into communion with one another in our common life reveals this reality of human dignity to us. A human being is not just something, a human being is someone. The seemingly limitless and unthinking expansion of euthanasia in Canada is profoundly at odds with this understanding of the human person. In that same commentary, we argued that we must also assert that our dignity is in no way diminished by mental or physical disability, or even by grave illness. If human dignity is an interior reality, which it is, we can recognize in one another despite external realities. If we recognize that internal dignity in one another, then we have no less dignity if we are limited in our material body. Human dignity is not something you can lose. Your external propriety, your ability to do things, or how you look, or your mental state does not determine how much dignity you have. Dignity is from within. But wait, if I am suffering, even to the point of death, don't I lose my dignity? The argument goes. You do not have less dignity when you suffer. For suffering does not rob you of what belongs to your nature, but may even serve to draw out its greatness and its beauty. Suffering can be very difficult to endure, whether in ourselves or in those close to us. For Christians, we believe that a human being has infinite worth because we are created in the image and likeness of God, which is much more than a physical or intellectual reality. There is unity between us as members of the human family, and we are in solidarity with one another, even more so where a fellow human being is suffering. Suffering does not diminish or end our dignity. Rather, we affirmed in our commentary, suffering can teach us much about dignity. It teaches us about the deep value of virtues, such as patience, obedience, endurance, hope, and trust, all of which are unique to us as human beings. We now implicitly embrace the view in this country that solidarity with others includes accepting anything, whether it is good or evil. The only criterion we seem to stand by is, does the individual desire it? What if what someone desires, though gravely, harms them, ends a beautiful, irreplaceable human life that is singular and unique? Euthanasia actually represents grave failure to be in solidarity with that person, as Brian so beautifully and eloquently stated, to suffer with them, to comfort them, and to gain ourselves an appreciation of the transformative nature of suffering. Let's be clear, suffering is hard, damn hard, but it is part of our human condition. Euthanasia is a despairing death. It is a lonely death. It is a profound rupture with the solidarity of others. And we have to emphasize, I think, again and again, that personal choice is not the highest good. Life, beautiful life, in all of its many complex stages, is the highest good. Human flourishing. As we argued about the patient who desires euthanasia in our commentary, the patient determines whether his or her life has value. If he wants to live, his life has value. If he wants to die, his life can be disposed of at will. The contrary view is that human life is not only valuable, only when people value it, but has inherent value on its own. To conclude, as Christians, our baptism calls us to proclaim the gospel in the world. This world, as it is, even in this time of darkness. In our proclaiming the gospel, we must represent to our society what it means to be a human person, as understood through the lens of the Incarnation. Because the Incarnation is true. For us as Christians and for everyone else, it is true. We must address this disordered anthropology as a severe amnesia. That is what it is. A grave and severe amnesia, a forgetting of who we are. Euthanasia is in one sense the most severe symptom of this amnesia. Human life does not have value because we choose it. We choose life because it has value. God bless you.
Thank you, Neil and Andrew, and you've had a lot of words, and Brian, you've had a lot of words this evening, and especially Andrew's summary of what a Christian would understand to be a worldview that would reject euthanasia was very well summarized. In one of my roles as the sometime president of an organization called Canadian Physicians for Life, we recognized that we were facing a culture that would not necessarily respond to Christian arguments. So we've tried a few things. I think I'll touch on altruism, dignity, suffering, and then choice, because you touched on those things in that order, and I think I should follow those themes along. Altruism. About 20 years ago, we did some polling, and it was an attempt to find out what people were really expecting from the euthanasia regime that was being proposed at that time. And one of the questions I thought I was designing very cleverly it had a couple of lead-up questions, and then there was a question that basically said, okay, so you might want a euthanasia death for yourself, a so-called death with dignity as you see it. But if you knew that changing the law to allow you that freedom to have a doctor kill you was going to put somebody else at risk, would that make you change your mind about wanting that change in the law? No. Like it was like 80%, no, not a problem, not a problem. So the sense that one should hold back on one's own wishes in order to protect someone else was not evident, at least at the time of that polling. Dignity. Dignity is for many people who have no concept of being made in the image of God, and no concept of something that might be inherent to a human being, no matter how situated. Dignity has been reduced to social embarrassment. People say they have a loss of dignity when they feel socially embarrassed by their capabilities or the situation in which they find themselves. Somebody else has to change a diaper for them, or their speech is unclear, or you name it. It's social embarrassment and discomfort, and that equates in the popular mind to dignity. So appeals to some sort of inherent dignity, which should cause us to value the person without reference to the straits that they find them in, seemed not very effective. Suffering. Once you bring up suffering, boy oh boy, the opposition moves in for the kill. When you're talking about suffering, you have this idiosyncratic, perverse, probably religious concept that suffering is going to in some way enrich your life or make you more worthy for posterity or something. And the whole concept that any tolerance of suffering should be part of your worldview is easily mocked by our opponents. So that takes that off the table. And then, of course, choice. It's all about choice. These people have elevated autonomy to the point where modern bioethics is basically just post hoc justification of whatever the heck you want to do. And it's all predicated on autonomy. So I hope we'll have time for a bit of a conversation with the audience, but I can tell you that we've tried a lot of stuff, and at times I feel like I'm out of ideas. I remember taking Jack Kevorkian out for coffee after we did a television thing about 30 years ago on CBC in Toronto, and he was quite an ordinary guy to talk to. He was actually quite a pleasant guy to talk to. He's dead now, but he was a musician. He loved Bach. You know, he loved playing the organ. He was not in it for the money. He'd actually come up from New York State by train in kind of a very ordinary clothing to appear on this in a kind of a debate format, and he was just absolutely focused on autonomy. That was the be-all and the end-all for him. It was kind of a pugnacious resentment of any control that anyone would want to place on anything as personal to him as the way he was going to die. So I've sort of seen 30 years of this, and it's quite amazing to watch the Right to Die movement get organized and do their thing. Neil is quite right in saying that it is individual actions and small organizations which together can sign until we have, 50 organizations that were objecting to this mental illness reason for euthanasia. Nothing else is really going to do it. It's tiring. At times it can kind of be boring because it's the same old topic over and over again. I think my family has had enough of my spouting out about it all. But we've got to do something about it, because what's coming is really sort of a parent's nightmare. You know, any parent who has a troubled child in particular should be just scratching their heads about the government of Canada. How on earth are you supposed to mouth platitudes about suicide prevention while saying that, Section 7 of the Charter means that the right to life includes a right to self-destruction if you might be spooked into committing suicide sooner because the government has failed to provide a doctor that promises to do it later. That's the kind of wonky legal analysis that's going on. You know, well, sure, if you're going to create a law that allows people to do that, then what do you do with the unhappy 20-year-old that says, there is no therapy acceptable to me? That's the way this law is written. You don't have to accept therapy that others might think might be effective. It's just, you just have to be convinced that the therapies available for your depression are not acceptable to you. And there will always be doctors found. You can go doctor shop until the cows come home. The Dr. Weebs and the Dr. Greens of BC will frankly likely be quite welcoming to you, no matter how tragic your family would find your death. I remember one fellow who told me that Dr. Weeb had approved his euthanasia over the phone without meeting him. Just said, sounds like, yeah, you'd qualify. Why so? This was at an early point in the law when he wasn't imminently dying. His death was not foreseeable. Well, it was for Dr. Weeb, because she told him, as this fellow explained to me, well, you've got MS and you can't really move very well, so you're going to get some bed sores and they'll get infected and then you'll die, so your death is reasonably foreseeable. So when you have sort of a kind of a reflex sophistry available in the medical profession, and you have the manpower out there ready to kill people, there's no check or balance available. All we can do is say, let's cut it off at mental illness. It's actually all mental illness. I don't care how sort of good your life looks from the outside, because it has been sort of upper to middle class people who tend to take advantage of this, people who love control. They're all people who have lost hope, who have no sense of their future. These are people who are actually suicidally depressed, but it's always dressed up as, no, it's not suicide, it's just we want a better death. So I think I'll end it there so people have a chance to interact. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, to Neil, to Father Deacon Andrew, to Will for those wonderful presentations and really kind of painting more of this picture, and I think it provides a great groundwork for a discussion that we can have now amongst ourselves. And I'll be moderating, but I also want you to feel open to speak to each other and have it just be a continuation of the conversation. So I have questions that I could start off with, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A from the audience as well. But maybe I'll start, Father Deacon Andrew, as you were speaking, I started wondering to myself, how do we present what, as you said, is now kind of the wreckage of a Christian anthropology to a society that is pluralistic, diverse, a country that protects religious freedoms? Obviously not everyone's Christian. And I've almost started answering the question as I was thinking about it. I thought, well, we should just get you to speak to them because it was very compelling. But how do we, I don't like using the word sell, but how do we kind of pitch that to a society which is so pluralistic nowadays?
Well, the gospel has always been very attractive. So it has its own internal power. The problem is us, as Christians in particular. We have to get off our duffs, frankly. We have to be well-formed. We have to be able to articulate a Christian anthropology in a captivating way and play to that deep conscience that people have. It's not because of some sort of accident that the Christian faith spread throughout the world. It's very captivating. And I think we have to stand with it. And we can offer many different sorts of arguments that maybe we sort of soft pedal it at times. I think those days are over. Right. I think it's time to really just give it to them straight. Sure. And I think this is really, it's crucial. And at the core of it, and this gets to, I think, what Will was saying and also Neil, is hope. Yeah. There has to be a rekindling of hope, and to accompany people, to be with them, to support them, to love them, all the points that you made in your talk. And that's what the church has done and Christian institutions have done from the very beginning. The Romans were scandalized that as Christians we treated our slaves compassionately and we didn't expose our children on the hillside. Right. So this is the same issues today. Just stay the course. Right. Yeah, exactly.
But I think, as you mentioned, and this kind of came out in various ways from various speakers, that the big problem is just silence. Silence. Just not being outspoken enough. It's something we all have to work on, absolutely. Maybe I can ask Dr. Johnston, in terms of what I talked a bit about the on-the-ground experience, you were talking about it as well. We talked about the providers of assisted death, but what about doctors and healthcare professionals who are not providers, who are maybe not involved? Are you getting a sense of what's the pulse on the ground in terms of the reception, what they're seeing? Are they being pressured to conform to?
I think the non-medical portion of the audience would be shocked at how aggressively the bureaucratic control systems were put into place the moment this was legalized. In one palliative care unit in Fraser Health, my spies told me that management had actually sent some auditors around to look at the charts. What they were looking for was evidence that someone might have breathed an interest in euthanasia. I just can't bring myself to say MAID because it's such a mealy-mouthed euphemism. But somebody expressed an interest in suicide, essentially. And what had the doctors done? Had they suppressed it? Had they not followed up on it? Had the doctors been insufficiently aggressive at presenting it to them? Then we have the Delta hospice debacle, where an organization which was explicitly anti-euthanasia from the time it was set up, that had put something like 750,000 volunteer hours into creating and running the hospice, had put millions of donated dollars into running it, could simply be disbanded and defunded by a government because not a corner of the healthcare system is allowed to be free of the potential for euthanasia. So the Catholic healthcare system is really on the edge. You know, they're constantly under fire. Canadian Physicians for Life exists largely to try to keep the flame alive, to make sure that people can come into medicine knowing that they can be a doctor without wanting to kill somebody, either in the womb or in euthanasia. And I'd say that the ethic of being a no-kill zone as a physician is sort of on life support in Canada.
Chime in, please.
Will, what do you think the prospects are for some creative entrepreneurial developments in healthcare in Canada, where faith-based healthcare can provide a place where we don't kill?
I'd say that healthcare is so darned expensive that everybody relies on government so if you could have a kind of a settlement like the Catholic schools set up, where in Manitoba in particular, where they would be funded out of the public purse because Catholics have to actually contribute to the public purse, that kind of thing. If you'd have a recognition that who pays for the hospital, the fact that the public in general pay for the hospital doesn't mean that the hospital has to be conforming to every dictate of basically the woke mob. And that's what we would need. But of course, what you're saying is terrific. Couldn't we set up a healthcare capability within the churches of the nation? Just really, really hard to put into place and extremely expensive.
Dr. Johnston, you make a good point that it's one thing to legalize or decriminalize assisted death and then make it available for those who want to avail themselves of it. It's a whole other thing when you start to get into a much more kind of authoritarian place where you say either get on board everyone involved in healthcare or get out.
And the crazy thing is there's nothing in the Carter decision
right.
which makes it mandatory that euthanasia be available in every single part of the healthcare system, and yet that's the way it is interpreted administratively, and certainly by unsympathetic provincial governments like the present one.
Yeah, even at the end of the decision, the court also speaks a bit about, just in a couple of paragraphs, about what to do about healthcare providers or who may have conscientious objections to euthanasia and assisted death. And the court says in the decision from 2015 that those freedom of conscience, which is protected by the Charter as well, will need to be, as the court put it, they use the word reconciled with patients who want to receive it. And my view is that it certainly has been far from reconciliation. It's been something more as a kind of authoritarian, get in line or get out of the way, it sounds like.
Absolutely. These are untested waters. The whole idea that there's a large constituency, maybe the majority even of the population, who might want to be in a place that's free of euthanasia, where it's not being whispered about and the person in the next bed isn't being euthanized, and euthanasia-minded nurses and doctors aren't constantly laying it out in front of people at their weakest moment. This is the idea that it might be wise to just designate parts of the healthcare system for euthanasia and let people actually have that option, and that's been taken off the table. It's a very odd sort of upending of the whole thing.
Well, speaking of reconciliation, I'm just curious, Neil, given your organization's work, I'm wondering if, especially in recent perhaps months, have you seen a certain form, I don't know, opportunities for reconciliation between, I guess, disability organizations that don't have an Aboriginal or Indigenous kind of attachment and those who do, in terms of coming together to kind of band together to work on this? Are there opportunities perhaps for reconciliation as we often hear it termed today?
In relation to MAID, you mean?
Yeah.
Coming together?
Does it provide an opportunity to kind of come together, the Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals, and try to work together towards a common goal?
Oh, certainly, and our organization reaches out all the time to different organizations and individuals, and we had a gathering in November, Indigenous Disability Wellness Gathering. We had Rod McCormick from Thompson University come over and speak to it. He's a clinician, and so I mean, there's always opportunities. The difficulty within the Indigenous communities, there's always other priorities, right. And Jeff, you were talking about that today, wherever you are up there somewhere. there's always priorities. So this is just another priority on the priorities on top of the priorities on top of the priorities. So, but I would never say no, because then we'd just be defeated. So,
right. I guess just coming back a little bit too. Thank you. I'm just wondering. It sounds like, Dr. Johnston, you're not surprised when you see the stats on things like people citing a good chunk of people who received assisted death, say in 2021, as I mentioned in my talk, 36% citing as at least a part of the reason for their decision being feeling like they're a burden on others, or things like isolation and loneliness. It sounds like you're not surprised by that. Is that
not at all? People internalize the same attitudes that they were polling among Dutch university students in the early 90s. Some people were scandalized when a Dutch economics class was polled, and they were asked how many people here think that euthanasia should be justifiable, leaving aside all these moral issues, but just on economic grounds. And I think it was like, again, 80% of the students thought, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, save money, kill people. That our own government, what was it, 2 years ago, published a savings prediction of $69 million or something like that from euthanasia, and people internalize that. Oh yeah, this is kind of wasteful. I don't want all these pills and things, I feel like I'm a burden already, and it's almost a frugality. People think that the highest purpose their life could serve, as long as it lives, is to stop costing money.
In terms of the actual, the future of the medical profession, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who could also speak to this quite well, in terms of what it's like in medical schools nowadays, in terms of how assisted death is even being spoken of in that context. Do you have a finger on the pulse in terms of that? And have you heard what things are like in terms of applying for medical school, or just that experience?
I don't want to leave out important perspectives that Andrew and Neil have, but it's worse than you can imagine. Medical schools are really, really vulnerable to the kind of groupthink that is represented by adopting a euthanasia mentality, an autonomy-based euthanasia mentality. Just like they fall like nine pins to the craziest parts of critical race theory, and I get emails all the time where people have to specify their pronouns and stuff like that. So anybody that thinks that medical schools are going to allow true diversity on these issues, might be disappointed.
Right. Neil, you mentioned a bit in your talk, and also when we were chatting earlier at the reception, about you've actually had quite a lot of interaction with kind of the parliamentary committees that are involved with assisted death. And I'm just wondering, maybe you could provide a bit more of just your experience in terms of what that's been like. You gave a sense that it's been frustrating, to put it mildly, but just kind of a sense of what it's been like actually dealing with individuals who are, could be, I guess, senators or parliamentarians who are writing reports and making recommendations, kind of where things are at in terms of how they're approaching this issue from your perspective.
Sure, and I would encourage anybody that is interested is to watch those videos. They're online. The committees, you can look at them. But the committees themselves are very pro-based. The majority of the members are pro-MAID members, with the minority being people that have concerns with MAID and the expansion of MAID. So, and if you watch them, you will see that witnesses such as myself and others, other people from the disability community, the Indigenous community, anybody that would speak out or have concerns about MAID, the expansion of MAID, or implementation on any level, were kind of brushed off, weren't given the same opportunities to speak, often, disrespected. I know, and we talk about accommodations for persons with disabilities. Some of the individuals who had disabilities, they had to tape themselves first, and then they would play it at a higher speed during the committee meeting to get them in within this mythical 5 minutes. So we're talking about life and death. We're talking about death for persons with disabilities. Mature minors, you have 5 minutes to present your point. 5 minutes to tell a committee why we shouldn't, euthanize persons with disabilities, why we shouldn't euthanize 12-year-olds, But if one was to think that was an open and transparent process without any bias, think again. That committee, and for whatever reason, the committees they have they put in place that are appointed by their political parties. The agenda is clear: to push MAID through, to expand MAID, and to get it done.
Father Deacon Andrew, I know there are a number of pastors here in the audience. I'm sure as you were giving your talk, they're probably ferociously taking notes and maybe asking for copies of your notes. That wouldn't shock me. I'm just curious if you have any kind of further thoughts as they kind of think about perhaps how they might engage with their congregations, their flocks on this issue. You've spoken about, just we need to speak up, and maybe that's a key message, but any kind of thoughts that come to mind in terms of how pastors might move forward in trying to rally the troops, so to speak. While respecting conscience, of course, but yes.
Sure. Well, I think there are two things. First of all is to support people having a well-formed conscience. Right. Consciences are formed in a particular context, and so that's very important, and that's why we need such strong conscience rights protections, not only for doctors and nurses who don't want to play ball, but also for example, pastors and priests and ministers and rabbis who are going into hospitals as chaplains, who are being pressured often to give end-of-life care for someone who's about to profoundly violate what they actually believe. So that conscience protection is essential. I mean, it's really, really essential. And you've done a lot of work on that, Brian. The other thing I would say is to help people connect the dots. And what I mean by that is, and I'll use a particular story just to illustrate this. I was chatting with a Coptic Orthodox med student, and this is in Toronto, and he knew what he believed as a Christian, confessed the Nicene Creed every Sunday, every day in his personal prayers, but he couldn't connect what he was saying in the Creed with why certain things were wrong. He knew that euthanasia was wrong, but why was it wrong? He knew that abortion was wrong, but why was it wrong? So again, even we should not underestimate, and we've had this conversation at Cardus many times, all the research that we do on a variety of issues, whether it's education or health or family issues, we should, when we're speaking to our fellow Christians, we should not underestimate how much people in the pews know. There has to be a continued effort to connect those dots for people and to really help them. And that's the role of pastors and priests and so forth, but also of Christian institutions to help make those connections. Because if we don't have people that can articulate a robust incarnational anthropology, then we're really going to have a difficult time bringing the train either back on the track or maybe even, please God, get it back into the station.
I know, while it's still in my mind, Jim Houston asked you earlier if you've written a book. I hope you do write a book on this topic at some point, or many others. But I'm wondering if you have any books or titles that come to mind in terms of what might help maybe pastors in terms of what they might, for their own reading, for helping to form others, like any books or authors that really come to mind on this front.
I was speaking with someone about this one particular book earlier today at the reception. If there's one book that I recommend consistently on not specifically euthanasia, but on this formation of conscience and understanding how our consciences work, it's a book with a very bad grammatical mistake in the title. There's a double negative, but it's called What We Can't Not Know. You've heard me recommend this book before.
I have a copy, probably from your recommendation. Okay. Yeah.
What We Can't Not Know by J initial, Budzashevsky. I can give you the spelling later. But he's a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, and he has written a book. Doesn't necessarily present the natural law tradition in all of its glory, but rather talks about this question of deep conscience and how people just were hardwired in a certain way to know things. Sure. And he begins to take that and unpack it and provides a very accessible, for like an informed layperson, a very accessible way to understand our consciences and how they function and how we can challenge some of the lies and distortions that are out there, and how people actively suppress their consciences. And I was talking with a doctor at the reception, and he said he's convinced that a lot of his colleagues just suppress.
Muted their conscience.
Have muted their consciences. Right. But then when suddenly a conscience appears in all of its glory, they don't know what to do. Right. They keep trying to suppress it, and then it pops up again. So pastors, priests, lay leaders in churches can really help with that.
What we can't not know.
What we can't not know.
Yeah.
J. Budzashevsky, Ignatius Press.
Very good. Neil, you mentioned in your talk, you said you never imagined you'd be standing in front of perhaps anyone, but certainly the government, saying that, trying to defend why we shouldn't be euthanizing, whether it's mature minors or persons with disabilities or whichever group it might be. And this is all, I can't believe I'm even saying it now. And you also just mentioned like the people who are pushing for this from within the government. And I think to myself, these are fellow Canadians who, many of whom are smart, sophisticated, people who maybe we cross paths with on our day-to-day basis. What's driving it? Like, what's almost when this kind of dystopian kind of sensibility can almost come to mind. Almost feels like, are we living in different countries, almost in a certain way? What do you chalk it up to in terms of what's driving this? Will, you might have some thoughts as well.
Will and I were talking about this a bit too as well, and I think that many of the people on the committee have a connection to somebody in their life that they feel probably should have had MAID. I know that Senator Wallen, her mother, had dementia, so she's a strong advocate for advanced directives. I know Minister Lamenti, I believe anyways, has some connection to other things as well. Senator Kutcher is a very strong person as a psychiatrist to push it forward. So I think it's those personal connections that they have to somebody or some event that's driving that, and I think as Will said, when he was speaking, is that they don't look, or when you're talking about asking students, would you take MAID if it impacted somebody else? And I think that's the big thing when we talk about Canadians as a whole, and we look at MAID for the two tracks, track 1 and track 2, and as I said, we're more focused on track 2. When people ask about MAID, they say, well, do you want to have the right to die when you decide to do it? This, if you're at end of life, you have stage 4 cancer, and absolutely. But they don't understand the intersect that into track 2, and for persons not at end of life, living in poverty, same with mature minors, all these things, so they intersect. And I don't think a lot of people across Canada really know that. And even with the surveys that are done, we're talking about 80%. I mean, if I phoned up somebody in Alberta right now and asked their opinion on MAID, they might say, well, yeah, I think that we should have the right. Now, so, well, what do you think about the intersect with track 2? I'll almost guarantee you they'll say, what's track 2? Because people don't know. So when we talk about these surveys, and I look at Dying with Dignity survey that they put out every year, and I mean, the questions are very leading for them. Right. I actually called ISPIS and said, well, you didn't contact any of the territories in their Indigenous population. The person that actually had the poll, and they said, no, we didn't. I said, did you contact any First Nations communities? Not specifically. So if they talked to any Indigenous person, it was by happenstance, but yet they present that survey as representing Canadians. So none of the territories, none of it, none of the, 80% of the population there is Indigenous, but that's representative of Canada in their view. So I know when the government did it, they had 300,000 people do, but again, nobody looked at the intersect or understood what the intersect would be. So is it representative of Canada? And I'll say one last thing. Dying with Dignity just did a little thing on their Twitter site, saying, listen, do you agree that euthanasia, protecting that right, is a patient's right and they should have it? And the majority of people said no. I was surprised they kept it up. It wasn't a huge survey, but on their own site, it was less than the people that said yes. So I don't believe necessarily.
There's a little hope there. I should clarify that track 1 was the idea that someone was just about to die, and you cruel anti-euthanasia person, you want them to suffer another 3 days when there's no hope for them, and they're begging for an overdose of morphine, and that's track 1. Track 2 is this whole idea that you shouldn't have to be dying in order to qualify for suicide by doctor, and so there's a lot of they're trading on the general public acceptance of the idea that if you're going to die anyway, can't the doctor slip you something to kill you quicker, which is actually a crude way of describing good palliative care, in the sense that the doctor can slip you something that will make you suffer less, and then your death is an unintended consequence of better pain control. But the whole idea that people get motivated to fight for what sounds so repellent, the doctor giving you an intravenous and then giving you something to put you to sleep, then some potassium chloride to stop your heart. People get motivated to go that route often through personal experiences. Dying with dignity, I'm sure the board have all had a relative have a badly managed final few months or even years. Joe Arve, who was the very, very good, very effective lawyer who won the Carter case, who himself was a wheelchair user. I said to him once, Joe, why have you got this head of steam up to get euthanasia on board here in Canada? My mother had Alzheimer's, and she spent the last 3 or 4 years of her life curled up in a fetal position, and I just thought there must be a better way. So that was the only better way he could think of, and he ran with it very effectively, unfortunately, for Canada.
That's right. I think, Father Deacon Andrew, you might have the final word.
Oh, well, just to say that we have a major problem in our society with death, and we want to cure death. And as a physician friend of mine in Ottawa said to me, do you know what the human mortality rate is, Andrew? 100%. And it's interesting, the pandemic offers a really interesting insight into this, that it was during the pandemic that we began to really ramp up this plan for Track 2 MAID. Because with that sort of euthanasia, I'm in control. I control how I suffer. I control how I die. I control how people relate to me. I control almost everything. But then there's this little virus that comes along that I can't control. And apart from exercising, prudence and so forth as to how we dealt with the pandemic, often we went well beyond prudence, and we went a little crazy because we couldn't control it. And this is, I think, a very deep-seated issue that we have to address. And again, I think as those of us who are Christians and with other people of other faiths who have a robust understanding of what death is all about, we can work to try and address that. And certainly, I know from what I know about palliative care, there's a core element of palliative care is good pastoral care and good spiritual care. That's part of that. So we have to begin to treat the entire person again, tripartite person. So.
Well, we've been very fortunate to have 3 wonderful panelists, and I've had the privilege to moderate this discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists this evening.
Well, thank you all. I want to particularly thank, I don't think it's the wrong way, but the non-locals, Neil and Andrew, for coming out and speaking to us. Neil, I know you had a very busy time. Thanks for making the trek. Thank you all for coming. If I may point you to our next event, which kind of fits this one. We're here on healthcare, human dignity, and the loss or the importance of personhood. On March 16th, we have a couple of speakers come. One is Aaron Cariati, who is an ethicist and a clinical psychologist from California, who has recently written a book, and he's worried about the kind of managerial healthcare system, the objectification of the body, how healthcare becomes more rigid and more under government control, like some of the things that we've heard here. And his respondent will be Doug Fair from McGill, a theologian, so you have this sort of clinical psychiatrist, ethicist, talking about what he calls the rise of the biomedical security state and a Christian response to it. So I heartily invite you to come back for that on March the 16th, if you have the time. And thank you for this great turnout. Thank you for giving us a lot to think about. And I do hope that you will take this to heart, that there is things to be done, that the initiative lies with us. And I mean, if you want to learn more about a good incarnational anthropology, you should maybe take some courses at Regent. Thank you all.